Hi, my name is Dr. Nick Curtis. I'm a golf rehab performance specialist here in Brentwood, Tennessee. In today's video, I will be breaking down some key points from one of my latest podcasts with Nashville golf instructor Jude Lenahan, the director of instruction at The Grove. In this video, we talked all things wrist, elbow, shoulder, and even a little bit of low back. We talk about some different performance concepts involving these key joints, as well as some of the common injuries that golfers get when they are hitting off mats or maybe increasing their volume of play recently, and how that leads to wrist injuries, elbow injuries, shoulders, and then how even having issues with the way that you set up with your wrists can create low back pain. Learn a little bit more about how different times a year can result in different common golf injuries and how you can go about avoiding these injuries or starting to treat some of these things if you do have them. Let's take our first look at what Jude said is critical to understand about wrist positioning in the golf swing.
What's the variability that you might see in the wrist that could be, give you good performance? And then what are the stuff that you just can't have? So what are some of these variations you might see at the wrist?
It's mostly in the flexion and extension part, right? Like, so you have Scotty, who is a little more cut or a little bit more extension, right? But his hand path also goes towards the ball, and he's technically his handle looks like it's going to be over the top if you were to trace it right, and then he kind of shallows it out late with his body.
Hmm.
And then you have Xander and a couple of those guys who get up to the top. They start in flexion, they actually go in more in flexion, uh, which is great for power. The more flexion you have, the more you have to kind of deliver shaft lean. Or if you start to release that flexion too soon, that angle too soon, you're going to start hitting kind of pull hooks.
Yep.
But if you match it up to your grip, right, and a lot of it's predicated on what kind of grip you have. But if you match that up and you can match up the release and their posture to impact it, if they can cover it, you can play, Webb Simpson, you can play from extension and Scotty, obviously, and you can play from flexion. What you cannot do, in my opinion, is not have either, right? So some people they will pretty much supinate their trail arm. This will roll over. They won't have any radial hinge. They won't have any extension. Those kind of keep it flat. You pretty much cannot have that. You won't find any really, well. There's an exception to every rule. I'm sure we can find one, but the majority of players, you won't see that a lot, because if that's going to break down at the first foot of the ball, and you're going to be playing catch up and manipulating not only the club but your body to kind of do some funny things from there. And the PGA Tours, Pete Cowan says this. This isn't my take, but they're the best manipulators in the world, right? They're super strong, they're super athletic. They've hit millions of golf balls. They've been doing it at a high level their whole life. So when you see Daniel Berger and you see some different things, right? Like, yeah, but he can do that because he's an elite athlete. He's an elite manipulator. But in the majority, you're going to get the furthest if you can just kind of stay more to the fundamentals, pick probably a touch of flexion, right? Have that extension in your right hand. It's a stronger position. You don't have to do that much on the downswing. But yeah, it's if you can match up the grip, if you know what you're looking for, and you just kind of go off the anatomy and their skill level, you can win a major. Obviously, it's been shown with flexion and extension, and then you have people like Tiger who were pretty textbook flat at the top, right? So there's no right way or wrong way. It's just about matching up what you have to begin with in your grip, and then making sure that if it's stronger, then to match that up, and if it's weaker, you're going to need flexion. If it's stronger, it's going to feel like you need more extension, kind of thing.
So it can be important to understand some key concepts of anatomical terms at the wrist. Let's go over them. First, we have wrist flexion and wrist extension. We're looking for at least 60 degrees in both directions here. To help out, you can use the lie angle of a 6-iron. For the most part, the lie angle of 6-iron should be about 60 degrees. So what we can do here is, if we orient this to the ground, we know that we want to go from neutral to breaking that 60 degrees. So this would be from here to here, about 60 degrees. We know I can get a little bit past 60 degrees. Same thing for flexion. If I go back to neutral position here, can I break the angle or match that angle of that club? And you can see I can. Now, of course, do a better job of holding this thing upright, or use a friend. You can also use your phone to help measure that angle. Now, beyond that, we also want to know what ulnar and radial deviation is. So Ulnar deviation is the pinky side, where we're basically side flexing the wrist towards pinky side, so pinky side down. Thumb or radial deviation is thumb side up. So if we go from here to here, that is radial deviation on the thumb side. Ulnar deviation, radial deviation. Now, when it comes to supination and pronation, palms up is supination, palms down is pronation. Make sure your elbows are tucked at your side so we don't get shoulder internal external rotation included. Just here at the forearm, supination, pronation. So what do we need from these different motions here at the wrist? What we mostly need is just having access to all of these ranges of motion. What can hold these things back? Well, just no matter what motion we're looking to assess, there's two things we can kind of look at. Is the bony architecture holding us back? Is the way the bones are able to move, slide, and glide on each other holding us back? Or is it two, the muscle or tendon tightness holding us back? So for bony architecture, we have many small bones here at the wrist that connect to the two longer bones here at the forearm. What we need to be able to happen is, as we say extend, is we need these small bones of the wrist to be able to glide or slide forward as they roll back. So you can imagine my fist is a bone. It needs to be able to roll back, but at the same time, it needs to be able to slide forward and down. This frees up space to allow that roll to happen. This is how we get these mechanics. Same thing with flexion. Supination, pronation, we need these things, these subtle motions to be able to happen down there at the wrist as well as the forearm. We need the radius to be able to rotate at its articulation here at the ulna and the humerus bone. So it rolls to make that happen. If we have muscle tightness through here, that restricts that. If we have muscle tightness through the forearm muscles, it could restrict flexion and extension. Same thing with ulnar and radial deviation. If we have certain muscle tightness through here, it could restrict our ability to do this. Same thing, muscle tightness here could restrict our ability to ulnar deviate. Bony mechanics, same thing. We need these bones to be able to slide and glide to allow for this free motion to happen here at the wrist. Now, what is the position that the wrist should be in through the golf swing? Well, you'll have to talk to Jude about that. But the key point that he had mentioned was there are different preferences. So some people like to be flexed in this forward hand and extended in this trail side hand as we come through impact. Some people have more of a extended lead side arm and flexed trail side hand. It really comes down to athletic preference and what that golfer has kind of learned to do and is able to do consistently. The key here is two things. We can't have pain in these motions. Pain will alter motor control. It'll change what's happening there at the hands. We don't want that to be the cause of your wrist positioning. Two is we can't have restrictions that are holding you back. Same thing, we don't want you to choose a position or find yourself recurrently using a wrist or hand position because to do something different is restricted. We want you to have full free access to wrist pronation, supination, deviation, and flexion and extension, and that you can then choose or naturally go into a hand and wrist positioning that serves you, not being held back by physical restrictions.
Talked to a lot of pros in the area, and obviously low back pain comes up a lot. And I want to touch on that a little bit, but you had also mentioned, you were the first ones to mention that kind of classic golfer's elbow, or at least just wrist and elbow pain, essentially. You had mentioned a lot of members having some at-home, simulators, turf, hitting in the garage with concrete underneath. Are you seeing the same thing this year coming back as you start getting some more of your members coming in for lessons that have been hitting more at home?
I am seeing the same thing. And the stronger they are, if they're, juniors with higher speed, they even have some wrist injuries because of it. I think that's directly correlated to the turf and the lack of foam and padding underneath if it's just sitting on a garage floor or what have you.
What's the difference between hitting off grass versus hitting off mats and what you're seeing, especially as someone who's training for skill? What are some things that you don't like about changing up to mats?
When you hit off of mats, you have to know a couple things. When you hit slightly behind it, what happens is the ball comes up off the turf, and you'll just get these center kind of strikes where they just come off and they knuckle. And if you can hear it and you can feel it, but if you're not really advanced and kind of the feel and you're more beginner and novice, then it's hard to tell sometimes with
Right.
the mat if you're chunking it. And then, it doesn't give way like turf does, right? But it's mostly when people think they chunk it, it's more forgiving. But if you look at high speed videos, when you hit that mat, the ball actually pops up off the ground and you catch it almost on the level or up strike.
Right.
So you'll see these people, if they're in a simulator, they'll hit 7 irons off a mat, maybe 180 yards carry. If they go straight outside off the grass, they can't get down on it enough to hit it, in the second, third groove, and they can't carry that thing over 160 or whatever.
It's almost like it's almost like shin splints for the elbow.
Mm-hmm.
So as a hockey player going from hockey season to lacrosse season, where you're skating for 8 months in a row, and then you're going back to running in cleats on the hard ground or on the grass, shin splints every single time, right? And you see that,
Yeah.
even basketball players just changing what you're hitting off of for golfers versus what you're running on for field athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And you get these stress injuries like shin splints, and it's the same thing in the elbow. If you're hitting off grass and then you change the platform and now you're hitting off a mat with concrete underneath it, you're going to get that same idea, but now it's here in the elbow. So
Mm-hmm.
you just got to be careful about the way you ramp things up and when you switch surfaces like that.
What are some pain and common injuries that can happen here at the wrist? Well, at the wrist, we can have pinky side issues. One of the big, most common pinky side issues here is what we call the triangular fibrocartilage. So there is a little cartilaginous, almost like a little disc here in this pinky side, in the carpal bones, around the carpal bones on this pinky side. What happens is that we can essentially have damage to that TFCC. And what that will do is, of course, cause pain, but also dysfunction. We lose some ability for bones to slide and glide, and maybe that's because we are restricting ourselves from going and using that painful motion, or just structurally, it will start to resist motion at that wrist because of the pain. So that can be a relatively significant injury, injury to the triangular fibrocartilage. Now, besides that, we can also have what we call potentially a lunate, which is a little bit more central to the wrist. This bone can fracture, and as well as the scaphoid on the thumb side from the golf swing. It's pretty rare, but again, creating that impact in the golf swing, the way that the handle sometimes interacts with the hand and wrist, is it can create some fractures into the carpals, small bones there at the wrist. If you're having weird, recurring, sharp pain at the wrist, it may be worth having an x-ray to check that out and make sure that there isn't a fracture present. That being said, sometimes it's difficult for x-ray to actually confirm a fracture there in those small bones. Sometimes a CT scan is needed to get a very good look at what those bones, whether they have fracture in the cortical structure of the bone or not. Beyond that, we can also have tendon issues here at the wrist. So what is commonly known as de Quervain's syndrome is this tunnel here. You can think of your snuff box. If you see the tendons here on your thumb side, is some of these tendons on the radial side of the thumb side can have a tenosynovitis, essentially is what we call it. It's where this sheath that connects and kind of holds these tendons, keeps them tight to the wrist, that can get a little bit inflamed. And when you have that tenosynovitis, you get that common kind of wrist aching pain on this radial or thumb side, right around where the thumb and scaphoid is in the wrist. Now, when it comes to the elbows, golfer's elbows and tennis elbow, more common typically than golfer's elbow is actually tennis elbow in golfers. There's a few reasons for that. What golfer's elbow or tennis elbow is a tendinopathy, right? So this is damage to the tendons. Now, what we are looking at specifically at the elbow is this outside edge of the elbow and this inside edge of the elbow. There's two main structures you need to learn a little bit more about. One is this common flexor tendon, which is on this inside edge of the elbow. If we think of our backside trail side arm of the golf swing, this inside edge of the elbow, these flexor tendons all connect at a similar point and connects down here on the bone. This is golfer's elbow, this medial inside edge. Usually it's on the trail side arm. The issue here is if we are using some extension here at the wrist, is these flexor muscles are put on a stretch, right? These like to do this. Now they're put on a stretch, but they're also contracting to hold this club face, right? To maintain that face position. These muscles are contracting in a stretch position. If you make contact with the ground, we get this small impulse into extension. As you can imagine, from a little bit of extension here in this trail side, and then I make contact through here, we get this little blip into extension. It'll be very quick, you probably won't even notice it. But common impact, or if we have increased impact, say we're using mats, right? Or we're hitting off mats on concrete, or we just are starting to play golf again and we just tend to be fatting the ball a little bit, we have more of that, what we call an eccentric impulse to this contract muscle that's on a stretch. This is prime real estate for tendinopathies, right? These conditions create tendinopathies, where it's a little bit of damage to the small cells of that tendon that become inflamed and swollen. This is a tendinitis usually, which can then lead long-term into a tendinosis. So this is more of a chronic version of a tendonitis, right? So that is golfer's elbow, usually on this trail side arm when the wrist is in extension. Tennis elbow is the extensor side, so not the inside, but the outside part of the elbow on the lead side arm, most common in golfers. The reason for this is that we have a hand that is in a little bit flexed position. Typically, as we come through, this hand stays a little bit flexed. And what happens with this extensor muscles, which want to do extension, they're now put on a stretch. They're holding a contraction here while stretched. And then when we make that impact, we have this happen. So these muscles get put on a stretch while they're contracting. It's an eccentric contraction at this point. And that will put some stress onto that common extensor tendon site, creating a tendinopathy, right? Tendonitis to start. Long term, if it's not treated correctly, can turn into a tendinosis. So how do we treat some of these conditions? Well, the bone stuff, we need to get looked at with x-ray. If it's a fracture, it has to be rested and let time for it to heal. Then we can start the rehab process. If it is a tendon issue here at the wrist or at the elbow, it's all about loading. So loading is what got us into this mess. Loading is what's going to get us out of it. To start, we do have to play around with some rest time, right? We need things to start to calm down. But with a therapist or a rehab chiropractor, we can figure out ways to keep things moving while we negotiate that rest period. After that, we have to be very, very smart in how we load things up. So we need to essentially work through putting stress back in through these cells of the tendon that can stimulate healing and rebuild without re-injuring or inflaming the area. It can be a finicky process. Some people that aren't treated or don't treat this well can last 6 to 12 months of pain and issues in that elbow. So if we don't do it correctly, or if we're not taking care of it, then this can be something that really persists. So how do we load up through the tendons? Well, first thing we want to kind of work on is make sure there's no mobility issues. Here at the wrist, there are plenty of drills that we can do to reintroduce load that'll help stimulate or create an environment for these small bones to start sliding and gliding on each other again. Once we do a few drills to address that, we can start that loading process specifically into this muscle. Let's talk about a few strategies to get some of this mobility back into the wrist and the small bones of the wrist, not to mention integrating entire upper extremity mobility and motor control. And then let's talk about loading the elbow. So this is the downward dog for shoulder internal rotation and stability. So we're essentially doing a downward dog position, but we're going to change up a couple of things, or at least we're going to add some emphasis in a few key areas. One position or change that we're going to do with this downward dog is our starting position is just going to be our knees being raised off the ground 2 inches. So think just here like this. We're going to push down through our hands, and we're going to raise our knees off the ground 2 inches, and we're up on our toes. From here, this is what the movement looks like. We're going to start with our knees just a couple inches off the ground. I'm going to push through my hands, push, 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 until I finish at the top with my biceps just about touching my ears. Okay, now a few key things with this exercise is that we want to maintain or push down through the inside edge of our hands as we do this. Okay, that is very important. That's going to make sure that we don't come up onto the outside part of our hand, and instead of creating this great relative motion that needs to happen at the shoulder as we go through shoulder flexion like this, is that we're just going to kind of orient our arms through that position. We're going to kind of lock everything down. We're going to use the whole shoulder complex as one big chunk to move into that position. If we keep our inside edge of our hands down no matter what and keep some pressure through there, then instead we're going to get this nice internal rotation motion happening at that shoulder, where these different components of the shoulder complex are going to move on top of each other relative to each other. So inside edge of my hands, push down. I maintain that pressure, and then I push, push, push until I get to the top of the position, and I'm going to slowly come back down. My knees stay at a 90-degree angle the whole time. And again, we can just do that for reps nice and slow. I don't want you to think about just kicking your hips back like that, but instead, every bit of motion has to come from you pushing your body away from you through your hands. Otherwise, what we'll do is just shift our weight backwards, and it kind of takes some of that pressure, that load off the shoulders. Okay, so that's something we can do. From there, we can progress to, say, single arm version of this, where we might limit the range of motion that we work through, but otherwise the idea is the same. We want to keep that inside edge of the hand pressing down through the mat the whole time. Give it a shot. Okay, for this exercise or drill, what we need is a wall and your body. So what we're trying to do, the purpose of this drill is to create shoulder internal rotation from a position of a grounded or closed chain upper body, right? So the drill here looks like this. Key to this is we have a soft bend in this elbow, hand is at about shoulder height. All we're doing here is keeping this bend in the elbow as we rotate towards that side arm, reaching above the arm, and then back. The whole time that bend in the elbow doesn't go away. And what I mean by that is I don't want to see more bend as we reach through and then extension as we come up. I want you to get a soft bend and keep that angle the same the whole time. You'll be tempted to bend. Don't bend, just keep it the same. And then reach, 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 and then come back. We should feel the shoulder start to load up a little bit, as well as a little bit in the back of the shoulder. Again, we're just letting ourselves reach, reach, reach. Coming back nice and slow, a little bit slower than that. And then you do the same thing, other side, soft bend in that elbow, about shoulder height. Toes and feet stay pointing forward. Keep your feet flat on the floor as you do this. And we're reaching, 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 and coming back in. What we're doing is instigating or creating internal rotation of that shoulder while we're adducting or bringing this arm across our body. Important for so many motions. What we can do to make this maybe a little bit more advanced is start with a more internally rotated hand. So just take your hand and rotate it towards the midline and do that same exact thing. Now we're creating even more internal rotation. We're starting from a position of more internally rotated, which means to get more motion, we just have to continue into internal rotation. Okay, and then we can do that same thing where we even take our hand and we push our hand down to keep it there. Now, another key with this, besides the soft bend in the elbow, is keeping this inside edge of your hand where most of the pressure is coming from, right? So I don't want you, as you move across, is for your hand, your inside edge of this hand to start to come up. Even if it doesn't raise off the wall here, I don't want the pressure to ever leave this inside edge and move towards the outside. Always keep that pressure like there's a penny here that you're keeping from falling down on this inside edge of the hand. That's where we want all the weight, especially as you rotate in. Keep that weight on that inside part of the hand there. You feel the shoulder start to load up a little bit, and we're creating more shoulder internal rotation into adduction as well. Give it a shot. So these were a couple of great drills to not only get some action back into this wrist and palm and get these bones moving again, while also integrating that with what needs to happen at the shoulder to control motion like this. We call this relative motion. But again, it just integrates the entire shoulder complex and upper extremity into not only getting improved mobility, sliding, gliding that happen here, but we do it under load through the elbow, through the shoulder, and get everything else kind of involved. Now, if we're going to load up just the muscles here at the elbow and the medial elbow or the lateral elbow, there's a few common things that we can do. We can essentially do the same thing for each, but just a slight variation to it. Let's try a couple different variations. Now, this isn't the most glamorous rehab for elbows and wrists. If we want to load this tendon, say we have a medial epicondylitis or golfer's elbow on this trail side arm, what we want to do is load back into eccentric flexion, right? So essentially, we want to create a stimulus where we are extending this wrist, but controlling that, letting this common flexor tendon load eccentrically like it was before, but now kind of in a controlled environment. And we're going to increase how often and how much load we're putting into that. So a very simple drill here is just controlling this eccentric motion here, letting our wrist go into flexion while holding resistance. It's a very simple way to do it. I'd recommend sitting down, let this hang off your knee like this, go into flexion, control this all the way into extension. Again, very simple, but we need to get some load back into that flexor tendon. Another drill that we can do that will impact the medial and lateral epicondyle is this pronation and supination drill. So having a band splayed out, you can play around with a different resistance on it. Elbow tucked in at your side, you want to do palm towards ceiling or supination, and then control that back down into pronation. Pulling up into supination, control back down into pronation. We do the opposite where we start in a supinated position. We're going to pull ourselves into resisted pronation and then control that way back down. If we're working more on the lateral epicondyle or say a golfer's elbow on this outside, or sorry, tennis elbow on the outside, what we want to do is start with the palm down and then work our way into palm down. If you want to work on more of a tennis elbow or this lateral epicondyle, we want to start is with palm down and then going into resisted pronation. You feel these muscles working, and then control that kind of descent back into a supinated position. If we're working more on this medial epicondyle or golfer's elbow, we'll start with the palm down, tuck that elbow down, go into resisted supination, and then control that supination or pronation back down. Now, similar to a golfer's elbow, where we are going into extension but controlling it, for tennis elbow, we're working more on that lateral epicondyle. We'll do that same thing. We'll start in extension and then control that descent into flexion. These extensor muscles are put on a stretch, but they're the ones allowing the flexion to happen. They're resisting it and controlling that motion. Again, I'd recommend propping yourself up on your knee like that, as well as sitting down, and just try to focus all of that force into that elbow, letting those muscles lengthen under contraction. Another fantastic exercise, once we get things moving along a little bit, is a farmer's carry. We're just holding. We're not going into extension or flexion as we do this. We're just holding, and we can pace or we can walk in place here to get some changes to the load as we do this here and lean side to side. But just doing this to work on that grip strength, it's the same thing. We're holding isometric positions, but we have the flexor and the extensor muscles here working to hold these dumbbells or kettlebells in your hand. Now, for loading up through the elbow and integrating wrist, elbow, shoulder, we want to do some of those same drills that we did earlier. The downward dog variation, the different wall internal rotation drill. Great way to load through this joint here, but also getting these components all involved. Now, we can also add another little component to it where we get a little bit more dynamic force into that wrist. This would be more towards that end stage tendinopathy rehab, where we want to get real big impulses, just like the impulses that got us into trouble in the first place. We want to build that back into our rehab programming and actually build that resistance and tolerance up. Let's take a look at a variation of that downward dog that would put a little bit more of this impulse into the system. Okay, for this variation here, we're doing something very similar. We want to raise our knees 2 inches off the ground. We want to maintain keeping that force on that inside edge of the hand. As we push away, we should feel that force kind of trying to lighten up. And then as we come back down, we want to make sure that we are pushing through that inside edge of the hand. But now, what I want to do is kind of a pogo version of that, where I want you to still try to push that inside edge of your hand down. But as we do this with our knees raised, we're going to go up into one hand, switch. Again, when you land, I want you to think that same feeling down into that middle inside edge of that hand to get that hand, again, just like the arch of a foot almost, pressing down and in, getting these bones to slide and glide again on top of each other while we put impulse into the system. That includes this lead side arm, elbow, and then same thing when we switch to the other side, we're getting that impulse through the entire system. Now, another way that we can do this without going to one hand is just to do 2 hands. So, same thing, putting an impulse into the system, making that motor control happen through that entire upper extremity, the closed chain, where it takes and absorbs that force, while also promoting some of that motion here at that hand and wrist. Give it a shot. Give those exercises and drills a try. If you're experiencing some elbow and wrist pain, work your way up through these drills. If you aren't, but you know that you're starting to ramp up your volume throughout the season, it's go time, you can try these exercises and drills, try to get some of this motions back into these key joints and start loading these tendons and muscles before it becomes a problem.
And they get this motion here, and you'll see, like, when you come out of the ground shallow, you'll never get open, right? You cannot really engage your left side. There's zero hip tilt, and you'll see people who are like, my back's hurting. I can't really golf today. Well, golf is what's hurting your back. So it's this catch-22, and they'll take time off, and their back will be feeling good. And they'll go out and they'll start hitting some, and they'll play now and be like, I just golf. Like, golf's not good for me. It's your golf swing is providing you these issues. And you'll see all these videos. You can, any platform on social media, there'll be how to stop early extension, how to stop early extension. And I'll say this until I'm blue in the face. The majority of people early extend because they have to.
Right.
Yeah, it's always an order of operations, right? It's like solving a math equation. If you don't have the right order of operations, you're not going to get the right answer. And people will come in and they've been told something. They've been told they need to do this, and I'll say, why? Why do you need to do that? I'm like, I don't know. Well, why are you? There's something causing that. So let's let's reverse engineer this. Let's figure out what's causing that, and we'll start from there, right? And I say this all the time: the first lesson's always the hardest, because I'm trying to figure out how you learn, right? Not everyone learns the same. There's 4 different ways of learning. So not only am I trying to figure that out, but I'm also going after your biggest problem. And your biggest problem has led to 4, 5, 6, 7, who knows how many problems down the list, right? So we go in and we attack that biggest problem, and then that starts to clean up all the other stuff, right? They don't early extend just because they want to, right?
This is why it's so important to get a full evaluation. If you have back pain, we cannot stop at the low back. We need to look beyond it to understand really what is happening that is driving this pain. It's important to know that there's pain in the low back. It's important to know that certain structures are injured or creating that pain. We want to know what those structures are. But we also need to know how you are moving that is creating that pain, and we need to know why you're moving that way. That is doing a full evaluation. This goes beyond the TPI physical evaluation. It's a great screening process, that TPI evaluation, but we need to know what is every single joint up to, what is it capable of doing, and how does that measure up against the norms or what we would expect you to be able to do, and how might that be playing a role in creating the certain swing characteristics that you're fighting that is creating compensation and that low back pain, right? So anything can be a factor here. It's important to get a full look, full evaluation, and have a treatment plan that looks at and treats everything. If you have wrist issues that is preventing you from setting the club appropriately the way that you should, and potentially setting that club inappropriately is leading to compensation at that low back to help try and fix it, then we need to make sure if we're going to treat low back pain, that we're also treating the wrists and elbows and making sure that they have no physical restrictions that are holding you back. All right, if you found that video helpful, if you are dealing with any things that we talked about today, feel free to leave questions down in the comments or email me. I'd be happy to help. Also, give the video a like, share it if you found it useful, and check out the original podcast. That's Golf Podcast episode 46, Jude Lenahan and the wrist for golf performance. Be happy to see you there. Thanks. Bye.